All right. Hello and welcome to our first Imagine Belonging at Work podcast brought to you by Rhodes Perry Consulting for 2025. If you're not familiar with me, I'm your host, Rhodes Perry, and I'm really, really excited for this particular podcast and our guest today, who I will introduce in just a bit for some context. And there's a lot of context here. So just to level set, and we're going way back. So in the years leading up to the signing of the US Constitution, framers like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson were vocal that a person's civil rights should not depend on their religious opinions. They believed that everyone should be free to profess and argue for any view on matters of religion, and that no one's legal rights should depend in any way on those views, whatever they may be. Their words laid the foundation for the First Amendment, which Thomas Jefferson described as a wall between the separation of church and state. So since then, there have been several attempts that have been made at the federal level to expand these First Amendment protections. For example, in 1993, more recently, Congress adopted the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was later overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1997. More recently, states responded by passing their own versions of this law, despite constitutional protections for religious freedom that was enshrined in the First Amendment. Some believe that the state's actions were thinly veiled responses to the U.S. Supreme Court's 2015 ruling requiring all states to legalize same sex marriage and recognize same sex unions from other states. So these legal battles over religious freedom, they're not isolated incidents. They impact many parts of U.S. society, including the workplace. And increasingly, more employees are bringing their faith into the workplace, expecting greater accommodations. Research shows that religious discrimination is growing faster than claims of gender or racial discrimination at work. Recognizing the US workforce is composed of many different faith and non-faith backgrounds, it begs a really big question that we're going to explore today. And that question is, does faith belong at work? So to help us answer this big question, I'm really thrilled to introduce you to Jelisa Dallas, who is the founder and CEO of Go Brave LLC. Jelisa equips individuals and organizations with the emotional intelligence needed to break barriers, bolster belief, and build behaviors that optimize life for true belonging. Jelisa has a background in education and has developed resilience programming for nonprofit organizations, historically underrepresented communities, and for-profit and public institutions. So during our conversation, we're going to first explore what it means to cultivate true belonging. Then we're going to learn why religious discrimination is on the rise. And then most importantly, right, this is a conversation for people leaders, right? We're going to gain some practical insights to respect personal faith and non-faith beliefs inside of our workplace, inside of our organization as a whole, and certainly on our teams. And for our belonging community memberships, our belonging community members, you all have this front row seat to listen live and participate in a private unrecording laser coaching session with Jelisa right after the podcast recording. So if you're interested in joining future coaching sessions like this, connecting with amazing leaders like Jelisa, please check out the belongingmembershipcommunity.com. That is belongingmembershipcommunity.com. And our conversation, it is designed for people like you, for visionary leaders and those on their way to joining us. So savor this conversation, and this is the moment you've been waiting for. Jelisa, welcome to the show. It is really, really great to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I am excited to be here, while also nervous because as we're talking about the new year and all the things, faith and stability, it's different around here.
That's
Probably not much different than past situations, but definitely different. And so how do we approach it? So I'm excited and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
yeah. I'm really excited to have you here, Jelisa. And I know this has been a conversation in the making. We met at a keynote that I delivered for University of Phoenix, and I feel like it was last year, but it felt like many months ago, and so I'm just really grateful that you're here. And it's pretty serendipitous too, because tomorrow, January 16th, is National Religious Freedom Day. So it's a really good time to open up this conversation. And I wanted to start with, some folks might not be familiar with you and some of your background. So if you could kind of fill in a little bit of the blanks from what I didn't share in the opening, and if you could give us a sense, right, like in the way that you described your work, you help organizational leaders and individuals build this sense of true belonging, right? And the show is all about that. So I'd love to kind of hear your take on what that means to you as well.
For sure. And thank you for that question. True belonging, it starts with ourselves. I was and am breaking free from being a chronic self-sabotager. And so with that, it required for me to understand who I truly am, owning who I am, being the authority of my story. And with that, that's where true belonging starts. Until we appreciate how we show up in the world, fully authentic with who we are, granted, depending on where you are, who you are, how you show up, that's not always accepted. But if you show up in the fullness of who you are, that's where true belonging starts. And by your demonstration of that, that is what helps you to be an example for others and show up as a leader. And so true belonging started when I was like, I have to do something different. Because though this is my reality, I might face some challenges and circumstances beyond my control. There are some aspects I can control, and I need to show up better, and not based on other people's perceptions or opinions of how I should do so, but based on the fullness, the wholeness of who I am. And that really starts with believing in myself. And so with that, that translates into so much more, probably more than what we have time for in this setting. But yeah, that's where Go Brave came. I had to do more than what I was doing. And so yeah, I'm here today to share.
Yes, yes, I love that. And I really like I like so much about how you describe true belonging for yourself. And I think like one of the biggest challenges, right, as you know, in doing this work is really creating the conditions for people to be able to do that, right? To have the agency, just to choose, like, sure, I want to show up as fully as myself. And I know you, Jelisa, will receive that with care and vice versa. And that's not always a given, right? Like it's almost like 50% of US workers um, in most workplaces do not feel that sense of psychological safety. And
Right.
so hearing that, right, I'm sure for some folks it's like that sounds great and there's no way that I can do that because I'm
Yeah.
afraid I'm going to lose my job, right? So and I want to kind of like tie that back to personal, either personal religious beliefs or non-beliefs, right? Like when we think
Mhm.
about the First Amendment really guarantees the religious freedoms, right? The protections of that, and also freedom of speech, the ability to express your beliefs. And so, for employers, right, thinking about those organizational leaders who are tuning in today, from your perspective, how do you navigate that delicate balance between an employee's right to express their faith or lack thereof, and the potential impact that that could have on colleagues, particularly in situations where maybe someone might use their religious beliefs to justify behaviors that run afoul of, prohibiting, hostile work environments or things like that.
Mhm.
And, what kind of guidance do you offer to those leaders?
For sure. That is a big question, a weighty question.
Yeah.
And I will tell you now, as I mentioned before this conversation, that in the moment, I may have an answer that seems like, okay, but giving me the grace to shift that as time progresses
Yeah.
in
Yes.
life and as I live life and learn more, because I don't claim to be all knowing, but always growing. And in that, I think core values play a big part in how we show up in the workplace. And I would also say doing your research, especially coming into a new culture of employment, as best as you can. And I understand sometimes there are some instances where a person can't shift their employer and big things have changed, but your core values speak a lot to, again, how you show up in the world. And I think for those who are in leadership, looking at the core values of your institution, of your organization, of your business, and how does that fit in the framework of how individuals are coming into the workplace with their own core values and their own systems of belief. because that plays a big role with, gosh, everything.
Mhm.
I think we cast a lot of vision, especially in workplaces, businesses. As we're in the new year, we cast a whole lot of vision. We are here to establish new resolutions, even though I believe there's a necessity in revolutionizing our resolutions, having some radical change with that, but that's a whole nother thing. But with that comes vision. And I think a lot of times we forget that in establishing vision, there must be values in the center of that. There must be a filtration system for which we are making decisions, which we are seeking clarity and understanding, even to the point of applying trust and forgiveness. All of those fuzzy, feel-good words needs to be a part of that filtration system. And until we get that right, it's going to
Mhm.
be very difficult for others to be receptive or be accepting of those who are different. Those have different perspectives, beliefs, and social understanding. So I think that's where we should start, is looking at the values, both the business and the individual.
Yeah, I 100% of just kind of thinking about knowing your own values first, right? Like at an
Mhm.
individual level for anyone listening to the podcast is like really being clear, of how do you show up? Like what is your compass, your moral compass? Like what are those values that are just where you draw a line, right? If that value is not honored or respected, okay, this might not be the place for me. So that's like a really good litmus test or filtration system, as you said, of just, if you're in that process of searching for your next great opportunity, that's a really good place to start and doing your research and for organizations also doing that work, right?
Right.
In many organizations, nonprofits are pretty good at this or B corporations of, what are our shared values and really co-creating that, right, with the current workforce and making sure you update those and most importantly, putting them into practice, right?
Yes,
Like how do we put our values into action, as you said, like in decision making or for promotions or even considering new projects or, if you're a nonprofit receiving money from different sources, they're so essential and sometimes they're not used in the ways that can really help navigate some tricky situations. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And I think that that's one real core takeaway that I think for people in this conversation, that alignment between individual values and organizational values is a good starting place. And
yes,
we'll kind of we'll build on that with practical strategies and just kind of thinking about that power of bridging, right? Of
yes,
knowing that there's I mean, that's the great thing about a team or an organization is that there's so many different individuals that come from so many different backgrounds and so many different areas of expertise that can help you be great. And so, thinking about those organizational leaders or even people leaders, folks in HR, what might be some of those practical strategies to help a team bridge across their differences, particularly, when matters of faith or non-faith come up in casual conversations in the workplace, really to make sure that that mix can work. And to your point of really cultivating a shared sense of team safety and trust that, we can share these things, knowing that not everyone will agree, right? But it's a way of connecting more deeply in the service of that relationship.
for sure, for sure. I think a lot of times we have to go back to the basics of being human beings
Mhm.
when we're talking about practicality, because practicality brings us from the knowledge of a thing to, okay, now I have an understanding, I'm processing that information, now I can apply it.
Mhm.
We have to listen better.
Mhm.
Practically listening better to what people are actually communicating, and sometimes the depth of what they're communicating. Because at the surface, it could be, I'm fine, asking the question, how are you today? And, oh, I'm good. No, but what does that I'm good really mean? So
Mhm.
listening to all cues of what that really means, and then shifting that into asking curious questions or courageous questions, and even sometimes having to communicate your motive around it. When we take it's interesting because we have this self and then taking self out of the situation. When we're really curious about wanting to know someone, genuinely care about them, we take ourselves out of the situation. Because when we come in with ourselves, we're curious because we're trying to confirm a stereotype or confirm an assumption. And so practically that listening part and also questioning curiously is, I would say, foundational, even in having conversations of difference.
Mhm.
Um, really taking that time to genuinely get to know someone. And I know on a larger scale, sometimes you don't have that time to do that when you're thinking about organizations and, big situations, but creating space where at least there could be even small group connection. I think ERGs do a really great job, or employee resource groups do a really great job with highlighting difference in a way that it brings about awareness, understanding, and if used properly, can really help the bottom line in businesses. And so I think those spaces are necessary, and not to silo or separate, but to reinforce the value of us coming together as individuals
Mhm.
to create a better world, essentially.
Yeah, yeah. I appreciate that. And um, conversations that we've been having more recently, at least like when I say we, conversations that I'm having with clients, is really trying to navigate, how can we have civil discourse, right? And making those distinctions, right, between a debate, which is like, I'm right, you're wrong, right? And
Right.
moral matrix kind of stuff that's kind of a trap, or even like discussion, right? Where I have this kind of belief and I want to persuade you on kind of joining me in that. And right, like that's not in the service of what you're saying, really to seek understanding, to
Mhm.
have that kind of curiosity. And that's true dialogue, right? And it's kind of
Right.
like, as you were saying, like kind of taking self out of it and really being curious, like, Jelisa, tell me like this current shape that you're in of all of your lived experiences, tell me more, right? And what is that in the service to inside the workplace, right? Because I would imagine for some people listening to this, like, I don't have time for that. I have to meet my deadlines, da 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 da. But going back to what you were saying about values, right? It's not just like what we do together or the results that we have together. It's really like who are we together and how do we work together, right? Because all of the external results and projects, that's all going to shift and change, right? But like when we're talking about building culture, or as you say, like building cultures of true belonging, going deeper, appropriately in the workplace, right? But to
Right.
really kind of appreciate who you are, knowing that like when we do that, we build trust and we have each other's backs, right? There's more confidence in that. And so
Mhm.
I'm just kind of curious, like how that, like when you're describing, like creating these spaces, like you talked about ERGs, yes, right? Like these are
Mhm.
spaces where that's just like so natural, because there's also agreements of how we
Right.
engage in this. Where could there be other spaces, right? Like trying to be creative, thinking about 2025, recognizing that diversity, equity, and inclusion spaces, we really have to fortify them, right?
Mhm.
And so how could we expand from some of those great lessons that we see all the time, if we're so fortunate to be in an ERG and to experience those aha moments? Like where else do you see that? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Oh my goodness. Because I'm thinking about, local, and I'm thinking about really big picture, whether it's in your home and your family. Having these conversations in places where you're already safe, to
Yes.
explore the depth of your curiosity. So for some, if you're talking about faith, I would say I subscribe, ascribe, however you want to use the word, to the Christian faith.
Yeah.
Now, granted, there are different definitions of what that could look like for folks, but in your church communities or small groups,
Mhm.
exploring those conversations. I even love the library. I do a lot of different workshops and facilitations on different topics at the library, and
Mhm.
cultivating those spaces there to have some of those uncomfortable conversations and having people in the room who could really help you process through that. So whether that's a local counselor,
Mhm.
a faith leader, community leader, or advocate. I would also say in those safe spaces, just up wherever you can think you can lay your hair down, whether you have hair or not,
Mhm.
where you can lay that down and be comfortable in the fullness of who you are. That's
Mhm.
and I I believe everyone knows where that space is for them. And if
Yes.
they don't have that space, start off with asking yourself the hard questions.
Hmm. Yes.
I've
Yeah.
had to do that on plenty of occasions. And that's where, for me, faith and spirituality come into play because there's sometimes a knowing of, okay, yeah, I need to address this way. I
Mhm.
need to address this that way
Yeah.
when I'm in conversation or in community with people because yeah, it's not graceful.
Mhm.
It's not affirming, it's not compassionate, it's not loving. And
Yeah.
those things help me to go into spaces that may not be apparently safe and have those uncomfortable conversations because I've sat with myself for a little while to ask those questions of myself to determine, okay, what do I believe about this situation? Because faith, as we know, is essentially by definition a system of belief in
Mhm.
a sense.
Mhm.
Now, if we go deeper, faith has a substance about it that's beyond our senses. And so it's kind of like tangible but intangible at the same time.
Yeah.
So being able to recognize, like, okay, filtering, as we talked about before, the values, our beliefs to create those spaces again internally first, and
Mhm.
then going where we already feel safe to have those conversations, and then branching out to maybe more unfamiliar territory. Because in each of those instances, we cultivate courage to have those conversations and a greater sense of confidence because we've experienced, okay, I can gravitate out a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. There's spaces of safety, right? And it kind of goes back to thinking about the psychological safety that we were talking about in the beginning of the interview. And you had mentioned ERGs, and then kind of thinking about outside of the workplace, you had
Mhm.
mentioned faith communities, libraries, right? Like really thinking about, as you said, like practicing courage, right? And it's a practice, right? So finding spaces where you can already do that outside of the workplace, just to know what that feels like, because safety, like you said, like we know when it's there, and that's kind of a foundation for feeling safety and trust, to feeling belonging. It lives in our bodies, right? It lives in our nervous system, so we get immediate feedback, whether we're conscious of it or not, of, okay, I think I could take this risk, and we can have this conversation, and I know that we can have a dialogue to seek understanding, because I have enough information about you, Jelisa, that you'll receive what I'm sharing with care, and vice versa. So I think that you provided some really good examples of where we can start to practice outside of the workplace. And then, really kind of thinking about, internally, our sense of safety and trust constantly shifts depending on, we can be in meeting one and then later in the day, meeting five. And maybe in meeting five, we feel it, but in other places we don't. So there's a subtlety to that on an individual level. And I think for organizational leaders or people leaders to be mindful of that, of like, how can we cultivate that, right? Like, how can we cultivate um, boosting up that sense of safety so that people if I'm leading a team, my team can take some of those risks where we can start to actually have some breakthroughs, right? Of like new ideas, and, we're starting to perform. But it's risky, right? And it goes back
Yeah.
to what you do of like going brave, is like, how do we lean into vulnerability and taking risks? And
Yes.
when, we have maybe some historical trauma in the workplace or outside where we have taken those kind of risks and have experienced negative consequences. So I think that's really, really helpful, so I thank you
Yeah.
for sharing those examples.
And if I may
Yeah.
add,
Yeah.
I think vulnerability thrives when there is accountability. So if
Mm,
you have no one for which you're accountable to, then it's difficult for you to even start that conversation because you get to explore ideas. Now, granted, accountability is, of course, I've understand it as, us making a promise to ourselves to show up a certain way, to be authentically ourselves, and then it's a commitment externally. So
mm,
whether that's commitment, to people, family, or what have you, but that's where vulnerability can thrive because in that you can be restored. There's a restorative part of being vulnerable in a place of accountability because there could be correction. And
yes.
correction, I think, is really built for us to be better.
Yeah. Yes.
Now, when it's just straight on criticism, okay, then that's probably not a place that you feel safe in. But when correction is there to bring about, discipline and just a little bit more understanding to stretch you and challenge you,
Yeah.
then I think that accountability helps you to be more vulnerable. And then that's where that safe space can be developed for you to take risks, for you to process through some maybe stinking thinking that you may have, so
Yeah.
that you can really do life well with others.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So vulnerability thrives when accountability is present, right? And accountability isn't punishment, right? You had said it's more correction, and I view it as like that commitment, like you said, commitment to yourself and integrity. Like, how do you want to show up? And if you're not doing that, oh wait, hang on a second, I did this thing, and to especially for leaders, right? To like name that and model how you're going to like repair from harm that you may have caused.
Mhm.
And I think like in the work that you do, it's so valuable because so many folks that you and I work with are so fearful of causing harm. And it's like, like we're wired to do that. It's more being prepared like when that happens, like what are the options available for you to be in service of the relationships that matter to you, and obviously we're talking about this in the workplace, but I think this kind of work helps us show up as better humans in general in our families and
Correct.
communities, et cetera. So this is really good stuff. I wanted to go into two other questions before getting your vision for imagining belonging. And the first one is just in the opening, I was talking about the rise of discrimination on the basis of faith or non-faith in the workplace. And these claims are on the rise. And what was surprising to me in my research is that, statistically, like the increase is higher than racial or gender discrimination in the workplace, right? Like so this is big. And so I'm curious, for organizations, like what strategies could be available to try to minimize some of this risk of this type of discrimination, and risk being lawsuits or, claims in HR that are timely and usually don't result in kind of folks feeling whole or feeling understood. So I'm curious about that while we can respect, all of the diverse faith or non-faith beliefs inside of an organization. Like what are some thoughts that you have on this one? And I know it's a big question, but just where could we start?
For sure. Um, yeah, I'm processing as you are talking. Man, I think we could start with policy. We could
Sure.
start with policy. Like, what do we have in place now? I think a lot of people forget, what do we already have? We get so caught up in trying to create something new and do something different that we forget what we already have. And then does that need to be changed and updated based on our values as an organization, based on the people we serve? Are we getting the right feedback from the people who are involved, from all the stakeholders that are connected to what we're doing as an organization, as people leaders? If we don't look at what we already have, it's going to be difficult to adapt it to where we are. We talk about doing refreshers or looking at our bylaws or what have you on a regular basis, or our business plans on a regular basis. But if we don't look at policies that affect people,
Mhm.
like how do we how do we really move forward with being better for people? Because at the end of the day, organizations, yes, there might be a client or customer at the end of the journey for which we are serving, but within the organization, how are we best serving our people? What do our people need? And are we bringing the right people into the room to make appropriate changes when necessary?
Yeah.
Again, going back to those values, I can't help but to say those values carry a lot of weight. And sometimes it requires some adjusting.
Mhm.
And again, getting the right people in the room to make those adjustments. And that's why I think um, mentors, sponsors, advocates
Mhm.
for individuals who may be newer to the organization, or people who are rising up in an organization, needing those sponsors to say, hey, this person needs to be in the room for this conversation to really be successful, for this change to really take place.
Yeah.
So to minimize, because I think sometimes it's hard for us to avoid some of the challenges that we have in a workplace, no matter how many trainings, workshops we have in
Mhm.
place.
Mhm.
Some people show up without the best intentions or motives. And
Mhm.
so, with that, going back to what we have in policy, what we can do to make appropriate changes, and then start to implement them gradually. I know we have this idea of agile and let's work quickly, but it's something like this when it deals with people who are there to produce a certain outcome, we need to gradually start to incorporate. Fast is not always the thing to do
Mm-mm.
because people need to grow into a comfort level to actually execute in this area of understanding, in this area of acceptance, in this area of us genuinely getting to know each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think, kind of just to summarize for folks where it's like, like you had started with policy, right? Like, so what do we have, right? Like taking stock of that, and particularly around accommodation, right? Like, I think that that would be a really good place to start. And then what are better practices? Like, what are some of our other organizations like in our industry doing, beyond that? What are other employers doing? And I think the piece that you really added to this, I think, is really valuable. Going back, right, to what you were saying about courageous conversations is the dialogue, the feedback. And you had said getting the right people in the room, right? So, and you had mentioned ERGs earlier, thinking about folks that would have a lens that,
Mhm.
maybe the best thinking is happening in your HR department, right? And you've taken stock, you've looked at your policies, you've gone through it. We've got some trainings coming up, right? Is it really hitting those pain points, right? Is it speaking to what the needs of your workforce are? And I think you offered some really good feedback in that. So thank you. I know it's a bigger question, right? But just kind of going through some of those basics. So for anyone
Right.
listening, where it's like, oh, we're dealing with this right now, where do we start? I think that you offer some really good starting places, right?
Yes, for
Um,
sure.
Okay, so this next one is a big one, right?
Okay.
And so, in workplaces with accommodations, right, there's certain religious holidays and practices that in the United States that most employers are recognizing and observing. So Christmas, Easter, right? There may be other religious holidays and practices, Ramadan, Sabbath, right, observances that are not in certain workplaces, right?
Mhm.
So how can organizations ensure that they are providing the accommodations necessary for the current constellation of people inside of their organization, so that these kind of holidays or space to observe can be made more equitably, and that also includes for people of non-faith beliefs as well.
Mhm. I think two things that are really like, oh, I never thought to use it in this way. Um, I would say mental health days
Mhm. Mhm.
and floating holidays if your organizations offer them.
Yeah.
So off the top, those things can support um, those with differing religions or non-religions.
Mhm. Mhm.
The other thing is communication.
Yeah.
We need to know who's in our organization.
Mhm.
And it goes back to that safe place and psychological safety. Is there someone in your organization, excuse me, where you can express this is, something that I want to prioritize. This is a value of mine that I bring to the workplace. Because at the end of the day, when we're talking about values, our beliefs, our faith, they're a part of who we are.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Yeah.
that's what's going to come into the workplace. And so in that instance, communicating that with someone. Um, and yes, we can go through the formal process of communicating with HR or whether it's our manager, to see if there is a more formal process. You also, as an employee, if you will, looking at what's already in place. I know in my employment in different institutions, as I mentioned, there was a floating holiday where I could choose when to utilize that space. I know depending on the type of organization that you're in, you have vacation time. Granted, you don't always want to use your leave or PTO, however you want to put it, on that particular instance, but your mental health days,
Mhm.
certain um, sick leave, if you will, can go towards mental health days where you want to take that time to observe whatever holiday or, whatever event that caters to your lived experience.
Mhm.
And so I think those are simple yet practical, again, knowing what you already have
Mhm.
and then communicating your needs to make sure that you are supported.
Yeah, and the example that you provided around floating holidays is really it is a really important one, and it builds off of another podcast we had with Minnow Bopaya. We were talking about SHRM's recent decision to drop the E in diversity, equity, and inclusion because equity was too hard to explain. And you just
Mm,
provided a really great example. Equality would be 15 fixed holidays, and several of them are maybe religious holidays that are centered around Christianity, right? Equity would be 15 floating holidays, and each employee gets to decide what is it that you need to take care of yourself throughout the year, to take the time off that you need, whether to reserve your faith tradition or to make time to do other things, right, outside of the workplace. So just really simple, right? Like
yes,
really, like there you go. Like there's the difference, and so thank you for that. I
of
appreciate it.
course.
Um,
And then I
last
also
question.
think sometimes, sorry,
Oh, go for it. Yeah, please,
I
please.
also think
Yeah.
sometimes because so much is coming up, I don't think there's really anything new under the sun.
Mhm.
I mean, there's
Mhm.
nothing new.
Yeah.
And so with that, we think we need to come up with new and innovative strategies and systems to attack, or let me not use attack because that could be very strong, but to address
Mhm.
certain challenges, differences, situations that seem unfamiliar when in actuality, a lot of times we need to go back to what worked before. As I mentioned, the listening piece, communicating,
Mhm.
the basic essence of humanity. How do we connect?
Yeah.
Communication by whatever form, how do we build relationship? Connection, communication, understanding, trust, all those things that make for a thriving relationship, because we all know those foundations of what it
Mhm.
means to have relationship, kind of going back to those basics. Even if I know for me, I'm someone who loves words. I'm like, wait a minute, do I really understand that word? Let me look up a
Mhm.
definition
Yeah.
of
Yes.
what that word really means,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
the basics are just so forgotten.
Mhm.
And I think there might be shame around it because, like, really, I got to go back and learn how to do this.
Mhm.
But shame off you. Growth requires us to learn in different forums to get a better understanding of, again, how we show up in the world, who we are, who we're connecting with. And so, yeah, I'm gonna say that to the cows come home.
Yes. I love that. I love that.
Basics.
Yeah, yeah. I want to go into the last question here, which is my favorite. I like asking this of all guests, and because the show, the belonging movement, what we're trying to build collectively is a vision for the future, right? A vision for beyond the workplace, right? A vision for a belonging society. And as we peer into that future, I'd love for you, to really kind of take a moment and imagine what that looks like from your lens, right? Because it's all about co-creating it together. And so, consider the work, the leadership that you're doing at Go Brave, right? Like you started this amazing organization. You're playing a role in really shaping where we're going together. And so talk to us about that vision. Like what are you seeing? What are you hearing? What are you feeling in your tissues, right? And how do you hope that your leadership, around faith in the workplace contributes to realizing, to activating this vision?
Being kind human beings, if
Mhm.
I could wrap it up in a nutshell, because I have a, if I may be honest, talking about going brave, it's because I have this natural fear of what if, and I think we all have this,
Mhm.
like, what if this doesn't work? What if they don't like me? And essentially having the courage to be canceled. I know that may seem like really like, ah,
Mhm.
but sometimes it takes that. But if we pursue this in a kindness and a compassion and a love that is really unconditional,
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
I believe is demonstrated, at least for me, and the love that I receive from my relationship with God. It's personal for me. And I think if we don't see how it's personal for us,
Mhm.
we can look from a lens that's like so far away. I mean, not to be morbid, but when we lose someone we love, it's personal for us. And
Yeah.
so it gets us think deeper about like what was their impact in my life, like how did I even impact their life, and all those things in between. I think if we take it personal to see like, you know what, I can make this world a better place, and it shows up in kindness, it shows up in empathy, and those areas are courageous because
Yeah.
people can be nice nasty.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And so, building up a sense of discernment and knowing who you are, owning that,
Mhm.
operating in that authority, and again, using that to optimize every part of your life. Like that's what imagining belonging looks like to me. That love, that compassion, that kindness. It's I know it's fluffy, it sounds, but I just can't help it.
It's big stuff. I mean, I see that. I see your authenticity shining through. I see what you're building, and you said, really believing that we can make a difference, and I see that you are, right? I mean, even to show up to have this big conversation, which I think for many people they would run the opposite
Yeah.
direction. You said, "Sure, I'm ready. When do you want to go?" So I really appreciate that. And I hope for folks that are listening, or if you're tuning live, thank you so much for being here, Jelisa. If we have an audience, we'd be all giving you a standing ovation. So I appreciate what you've offered. And for anybody who is tuning in, if you want to apply the lessons from today's conversation, you could always, listen to this podcast again on Apple Podcasts or wherever you tune in. And if you're looking for more ways to connect with leaders like Jelisa, definitely check out our Belonging membership community. We're about to go into a laser coaching session right now. And we've got a few people here, and we'd love to see you in community with us to explore these questions more deeply as we practice community care, collaboration, creativity, right? So thank you so much for being here. And Jelisa, thanks so much. We'll be chatting a little bit more. And thanks for growing the belonging movement, y'all. We'll be back in a couple weeks.